test the things that I have to say this evening by the Word of God. Find to be the truth. Hope we take things like our day will supply. But we believe here being better servants of God in the future than we have in the past. This evening, our Lord willing, this evening we'll be discussing how to make our gospel meetings successful. We're a couple of weeks away from our gospel meeting, and there's some things that we can do that we learn from Scriptures that can help us to make the effort successful. And so, this evening we're going to talk about how to make our gospel meeting successful. If you recall, a couple of weeks ago, we began not as I said then, a normal series of lessons where we each week discuss the topic of sin and worldliness, but we began discussing, as we said we would from time to time, some different issues of sin and worldliness that not only face those of the world, but face those in the church. As we noted, the things that are problems in the world eventually become things that are problems to those in the church. There's a saying that, and we quickly approach the month of April, April showers bring May flowers. So when April turns around, you'll expect a lot of rain. But along with that, in the month of April is typically the time frame in which most schools have their prom. And so what we're going to discuss for the next few moments this evening is what the Bible has to say concerning the topic of dancing and the prom. 5 things we're going to talk about. We're going to start with some principles on which we all agree. There's some things that as we begin this study that we'll understand, help us in our understanding, some principles that everyone will agree on. We then will define what we're talking by dancing and the prom. We will talk about the appeal of dancing and the fact that the appeal of dancing is sexual in nature. Then talk about the biblical principles that are violated by dancing at the prom. And then we'll answer the arguments that are try to use to justify dancing and the prom. Let's begin this morning by talking about principles we all agree on. We would all agree that we strive to apply biblical principles in every decision that we make and every activity we engage in. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 17, the Apostle Paul writes by inspiration, "And whatever you do, in word or in deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus." And so we strive in every decision we make, whether it's how we live in our day-to-day lives, whether it is the things we do gathered together in the acts of worship, to apply this biblical principle in every decision we make. That we go back to God's Word as the standard of authority. We would agree that we seek to avoid, or should seek to avoid, anything that could be a questionable decision in our life. And so we go back to that principle, and if we look at the things and say that something may be questionable, we want to seek to avoid anything that might cause some question or any questionable decisions, because we're striving to live as a holy people. We would agree we'd be more concerned about God's approval than man's. In Galatians chapter 1 and in verse 10, the Apostle Paul said, "For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God?" Because we know that this principle, as we discussed this morning, is a principle that man approves of. But the question is not, does man approve? The question is, does God approve? And then I think we would all agree on the principle, we all live around the principle that something does not have to be expressly forbidden in order for it to be wrong. In the passage that Danny read for us, in Galatians 5 and 19 through 21, the Apostle Paul concludes this section of what we refer to as the works of the flesh. As he said, the works of the flesh in verse 19, he says that they are drunkenness, revelries, and things like these. Which tells me that Galatians chapter 1 is not an exhaustive list of everything sinful in nature. I want you to think about this book for just a moment. It was in an article on the Veteran Parkway Church of Christ website where it said, where the title of it was the Prom, Promenade or Promiscuity. But the Bible doesn't say, that's the title of the article. Does God have to spell out everything? Not according to Galatians 5, 19 through 21. Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are immorality, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. Wonder what he meant by things like these. Apparently his list of specifics wasn't exhaustive. And apparently there are things like these that you need to look at carefully and avoid. God doesn't spell out everything because He thinks you're smart enough to use the mind power given you in order to reach the right conclusion. To that I say, amen. They're right. There are things that we would agree that the Bible would condemn, not by direct statement of it saying this is wrong, but by it violating some biblical principle. For example, we talked about gambling, or drug use, or even pornography. There's no passage that you open up and says, thou shalt not gamble, or thou shalt not use drugs, or thou shalt not view pornography. But we understand they're wrong because they violate other biblical principles. That's what we want to consider this morning when we consider the topic of dancing in the prom. There is no passage that says, thou shalt not dance. The question is, does it violate any other biblical principle? Now, let's understand this too. As we discuss dancing in the prom, we see principles we agree on. Let's define what we're talking about, though, by dancing in the prom. Let's define what our terms dancing and prom are. That helps us when it comes to some of these other things and the appeal of dancing. When I understand what dancing is and I understand about the prom. Dancing is defined as such by Roller. Dancing is an expression in rhythmic movement of an intensified sense of life arising from an inner perception that stimulates both mind and body. The American Heritage Dictionary defines it as to move rhythmically to music using prescribed or improvised steps and gestures. So we understand, you hear somebody talk about dancing, that it is movement to music. So there's several different kinds of dances. We'll talk about the specific one that we're addressing this morning when it comes to dancing and the prom. But there are several kinds of dances, and the point of these dances is that you're moving in rhythm to the music. And so there may be prescribed and improvised steps and gestures as you hear about the different kinds of dance, like the waltz, the tango, the salsa, and there are many others. And I don't know the list of them all, but the point is that all of those come back to the same basic principle as a rhythmic movement to music. But now we're not just talking about any kind of dancing we're wanting to consider right now. In particular, we want to consider the idea of the slow dance. That's what's under consideration that takes place at these proms. Slow dance involves the close contact while moving in rhythm to music, and often involves a romantic atmosphere. And we'll find later on talk more about that later on as we read the appeal of dancing and it's described more in detail. But as we consider the slow dance involves close contact while still moving in rhythm with music, going back to our basic definition of dancing, but a romantic atmosphere. And so that's the dancing that we're really considering a great deal this morning. Now, along with dancing, we want to define the term prom. The word prom is a shortened version of the word promenade. The word promenade literally means to drive or herd forward. It was used in times past to refer at times to the opening dance at a ball, and it's just a term that means to drive or herd forward. But since the early 1900s, it is used in reference to a formal dance. That's why people talk about the junior and senior proms coming up. And so, that's the term prom or promenade. It's a short version of the word promenade. This is a formal dance for your consideration. By the way, we're talking specifically about the prom. This would apply, the same principle applies to any kind of dance. As we're defining dancing in the prom and being the time of year, we're defining specifically the prom as that is the one shortly around the corner. The formal dance, the prom, is used today. American Heritage Dictionary defines it as a ball or formal dance held by a high school or college class. Webster and OED would get similarly define the term. It's just a ball or a formal dance held by a high school or a college class. So that's what the prom is. So we can take that base definition too and consider the dancing and informal dances, but the prom being the specific one we're mentioning this morning. Let's spend some time talking about the appeal of dancing. I think it's important that we understand, as we discuss the topic of dancing, what the appeal of dancing is, and that is the appeal of dancing is sexual in nature. As we go through some of these quotes, you'll see more and more people who define it as such. As we talk about dancing and its appeal, let's start with some quotes. The first one doesn't deal specifically with dancing being sexual in nature, but I do think it's an interesting point to bring up. Former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said that most juvenile crime has its inception in the dance hall, either public or private. I think that is quite interesting to understand that in his experiences, serving as the director of the FBI and his years in law enforcement, most juvenile crime actually began at the dance hall. Something from there led to them coming and committing some kind of crime. But let's look at a series of other quotes from people where they talk about dancing, some of the pitfalls of dancing, and its appeal. By the way, to note ahead of time as we go through, the vast majority of these, there'll be some quotes by some members of the church. The vast majority of the things we're going to say on this point are quotes by people of the world and how they describe dancing. Professor W.C. Wilkerson of Chicago University said it is a system of means contrived with more than human ingenuity to excite the instinct to such action. That is how he defined dancing. T.A. Wagner, who was the former supervisor of the Dancing Academy in California, said no woman can waltz well and waltz virtuously. It's interesting that somebody who made their living being a supervisor of a dance hall or a dance academy said that if a woman is waltzing well, it cannot be virtuous in its nature. J.P. Gibson, among those who dance, it is noteworthy that very few girls spend much time dancing with other girls. Neither do men dance very much with their own wives, nor brothers with their own sisters. The secret of the popularity of dancing, or is it a secret, is the exciting sexual stimulation resulting from the close embrace of male and female, whether it be in music, with music and dancing, or without music and patting and necking. And so J.P. Gibson, MD, here, as he defines dancing and talks about why the appeal of dancing, says it's because of the stimulation received by the close contact. He parallels it to the same thing received in patting and necking. Here's a quote. This is by a member of the church, Brother Homer Haley. Said, it is true that only a minority of church members dance, and possibly only a small minority. But to whatever degree dancing is tolerated among members of the body, to just that degree the church tends toward the world and allows the spirit of the world to infiltrate. As Brother Haley pointed out, that is those in the church tend more towards dancing and going to the dance. That's just that degree more. The church is tending more and more towards the world and farther from what it should be. Here's a quotation from the book Dance with Must. It was printed in 1938, reprinted in 1950. Page 6 of that book. This is from a series of lectures by Ted Shawn at George Peabody College for Teachers. He said another motive for the dance is a sexual motive. The dance has always been used as a means of expressing sexual desire and as a means of wooing. We find the same sex motive in the modern ballroom dance, which is now degenerated into dull and stupid forms, but is a legitimate opportunity for contact. And that is how it is often viewed. That it is okay in dancing, so this legitimate opportunity for contact, even though he says it's a means of expressing sexual desire and wooing. Again, this is somebody in a college lecture. This is a quotation from a gospel preacher. Here's an interesting note. Urban Edwards, an LA radio host, asked this question of somebody who was interviewing one Arthur Murray. He asked Arthur Murray why his ballroom dancing declined. Years ago, they saw the number of people ballroom dancing was declining, the number of people attending these events was declining. He said, why is it declining? Arthur Murray said, since dancing is based on sexual flirtation, and since young people have no problem with sexual flirtation, dancing has taken a back seat to the back seat. It's interesting, as he points out, And as you look at the world today, about those who engage in sexual relations outside of marriage, that as the number increases of those who will try to enjoy the sexual relationship outside of the confines of marriage, the number of those engaged in ballroom dancing declines. To which he goes on to say, this only confirms what we already know. Dancing leads from the ballroom to the bedroom. There's another one. Mark Weissman, PhD, wrote an article, "When the answer is not tonight." I know we're running through these quickly. We're going to come back before summarize all this, but just want to get a picture of how this is painted, of the appeal of dancing. He defined, Mark Weissman talked about in his book, "When the answer is not tonight," he said, you think about activities that lead to sex. A dark crowded room with whispers of delight. The dance floor, a proven place for the struggling couple, a romantic dinner with a band, candles, and the right foods. It's interesting as he talks about these activities that lead to one engaging in a sexual relationship, that along with these romantic candlelit dinners and all these things is the dance floor. Here's another quote. Bear with me just a moment. This is a lengthy quote. It begins by saying, "We are all men. We know the natural desires of youth. We know that sex is the strongest impulse implanted in the human race. You can picture the effect on a boy or girl of 18 or 20. When his hunger is the keenest, when the knowledge and experience is lacking, and foremost the judgment of one of these dances which calls for the close abdominal contact, and frequently bring the cheeks together and entwine the limbs." Goes on later in the article to say there is but one reason for the popularity of the dance, and that is sex appeal. I hasten to assure you that I do not believe the dancers are always conscious that this is the reason they enjoy this position and the steps that go with it. But this lack of consciousness is merely an added factor of danger. When you are told that youth of both sexes can survive this experience without mental, moral, or physical pollution, you know the teller lies. If you believe that youth is the same after this experience as before, then God help your children in your charge, for you are not mentally fit for your responsibility. If you do not believe I have correctly described the modern dances and their effect, you either have not seen them perform or you are willfully blind to their true nature. It's interesting as you read that quote, and I read about the dangers of dancing and all these things. I would think this is a quote by somebody who was a gospel preacher, or at least some religious person. This is a quote by Louis Guyan, who's the owner and operator of Chicago's largest dance club. He made his living off the dance hall. Yet if you go back to what he said earlier in this quote, he talked about how these dances and the close contact they call for, how they bring to mind that relationship and that impulse, and that it only adds to the danger of young people when they dance, and that they cannot survive that experience without any mental, moral, or physical pollution. That's somebody who made their living being around them. If anybody can tell you they couldn't survive without mental, physical, or moral pollution, it'd be somebody who saw it every single day. There's another one. Dr. Lady S. Hollingsworth, professor of education at Columbia University. Dancing is an exciting, pleasurable activity, as it affords a partial satisfaction of the sex impulse. Dancing, in fact, is such an erotic stimuli that it even works for boys and girls as young as the age of 11. I think that tells us something about the true nature of these dances, that it is so powerful that it has an impact even on those as young as the age of 11. Here's another quote, another little bit lengthy one. It's not quite as long as the previous one. But this is a quote. A couple more quotes I want to see here. This is a quote by Todd Clifford of Hamilton, Alabama. He's a graduate of Free Harvard. He said, while the word prom is a shortened version of the word promenade, it might well be a shortened version of promiscuity. Remember earlier in that article, promenade or promiscuity? A Google search of the words prom and sex resulted in over 1.4 million hits. Admittedly, not all of them were concerned with sexual activity as it relates to prom, but each word, including the first one. The link sent me to TeenDevice.com and it's Prom Central. Here I found a long list of articles, of links to articles, including how to have sex on prom night. Among other links were numerous articles that promoted prom as the night to lose Christian parent who does not know these things only does so by turning a blind eye to the whole situation. I think it's interesting as you go back to what we said in the earlier part of the book, that if you search those two words together, prom and sex, it results in 1.4 billion hits on Google. And while they may not all relate to one engaging in the sexual relationship after prom night, a number did, including links telling them how to have sex on prom night and promoting it as the night to lose one's virginity. One more quote, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the appeal of dancing before we go on and talk about the biblical principles violated. This is a quote by Brother J.R. Bronger. Brother Bronger did not grow up going to church. He didn't obey the gospel, I believe, until his 20s, maybe 30s. Been a gospel preacher for 40 or 50 years, I think, at this point. This is what Brother Bronger said in an article about the prom, entitled, "Are You Going to Prom?" He said, "I was not raised to respect the Lord, so I participated in dances of all kinds, including the prom. The high school I attended had regular dances. Therefore, I am well aware of what dancing and dances are all about. I was never compelled to consider whether dancing was right or wrong until after I became a Christian. What's wrong with modern dancing? The modern expression of dancing involves lewdness or lasciviousness, which according to Galatians 5:19 is the work of the flesh. Lasciviousness is sinful, anytime, anywhere. Dances are held for one reason: sex appeal. Whether slow cheek to cheek, hip to hip, swaying to sensuous music, or pumping and grinding to pulsating beats, sex appeal or lasciviousness is what dancing is all about. Dancing is a way to legitimize the sensual fondling of another. It is nothing but foreplay." Brother J.R. Bronger's article, "Are You Going to Prom?" You think about it as he describes there, as he talks about his experience when he went to dances before. As he would go to these dances, he said that it's all focused on one thing: sex appeal. It's all focused on one thing, and it violates the biblical principles we'll talk about in a moment of lasciviousness or lewdness or sensuality, depending upon your translation. Now, here's the point I want to make and drive home. Dancing is sexual in nature. That's the point. Whether it's a quote by brethren, whether it's a quote by medical professionals, by those in the education industry, whether it's a quote by those who made their living because of dancing, they all came back to the same general conclusion. Dancing is about one thing and one thing alone: sex appeal. That is the point of dancing. Which leads me to ask this question. To help us understand that point, what would we think if we walked in and saw two boys dancing together that close, as we see with members of the opposite sex? Perhaps you would conclude, and you would likely conclude, that if two boys were dancing that close together, they're probably homosexuals. And the reason you would reach that conclusion is because of the close, intimate contact involved in dancing. It's still close, intimate contact when they're members of the opposite sex. Here's a question for us to consider. How would you react if you saw your son or your daughter that close in proximity to their significant other without the music playing? How would you react if you saw your son or daughter that close in proximity to their significant other without music? I think we would probably all be mad about it. Put a stop to it. And why is it if I pick up my phone and go to my Amazon Music and hit the play button on a song, that all of a sudden it's okay? Here's a question. Why do we feel different when music is involved? What is it about the play button on the MP3 player or phone that makes it okay? The appeal is the same, just as if they were that close in embrace without music. Now let's talk about the biblical principles that are violated. Now that we have an idea of the appeal of dancing, I think I can make it quite clear as we move through the biblical principles that are violated by dancing at prom. Number one, it was mentioned several times in some of those articles going back to the beginning, the principle of lasciviousness, lewdness, sensuality. depending on your translation. Thayer defines this word as unbridled lust, excess, licentiousness, lasciviousness, wantonness, outrageousness, shamefulness, filthy words, indecent bodily movements, and unchaste handling of males and females. Webster says it means lewd, wanton, lustful, tending to produce lewd emotions. Webster defines lewd as given to the indulgence of lust or proceeding from unlawful sexual desire. As you read through that definition of lasciviousness or licentiousness or sensuality, however your Bible translates it, the last word there in Galatians 5:19. If dancing isn't lasciviousness, again, the definition: unbridled lust, excess, lasciviousness, wantonness, outrageousness, shamefulness, filthy words, particularly these two: indecent bodily movements and unchaste handling of male and females. If that's not lasciviousness, I don't know what is, because it violates the principles of lasciviousness. No, there's not a biblical passage that says thou shalt not dance. There's a biblical principle of lasciviousness that will lead us to that conclusion. But also, we're just thinking about the use of this word in the New Testament. Galatians 5:19 is not the only use of lasciviousness or sensuality in the New Testament. Go with me for just a moment to Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7 and verse 22. Mark 7:22. This is something, this lasciviousness or sensuality is something that proceeds out of the heart, from the heart. Mark 7:22. Or back to verse 21. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, or lasciviousness, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within. It proceeds out of the heart of man, first and foremost. Just like sexual immorality and theft and murder and coveting and all of the other things. Now these lips. Sensuality not only proceeds from the heart, and as a result of the heart, sensuality is a characteristic of the rest of the Gentiles. Or, as that phrase is used, referring to the rest of the world. Go to Galatians 4. Galatians 4, beginning in verse 17, the point is made that we should not be like the world. Beginning in 17, he says, Now this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God, because of their ignorance that is in them, due to the hardness of their hearts. So he says, don't live like them, those that are darkened in their understanding, those who are alienated from the life of God. Verse 19. They have become callous and have given themselves to sensuality. The same thing that we saw in Galatians 5 as a work of the flesh. So the rest of the Gentiles, the rest of the world, how they walk is in sensuality. Sensuality is a work of darkness, according to Romans 13, 11 through 14. A work of darkness that must be cast off. Look at Romans 13. Romans 13, beginning at verse 11. Romans 13, beginning at 11. Besides this, you know the time, that the hour has come for you to awake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us than when we first believed. The night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Now here's a list of those. Let us walk properly in the daytime, not in revelries and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy. Sensuality or lasciviousness, Paul says in Romans 13, is something that is to be cast off or put far away from us. According to Ephesians 4, that's how the rest of the world works. According to Mark 7, it proceeds from the heart. And according to Galatians 5, it will keep us out of heaven. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 19 beginning, the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, here's our word, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, revelries, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, passage, lasciviousness or sensuality is something that can keep us out of heaven. It's something that proceeds from the heart. It's something the rest of the world does. What biblical principles are violated by dancing at the prom? The principle of lasciviousness or sensuality. Say another. It's violated. Go to 2 Timothy chapter 2. Look at just one of these. 2 Timothy chapter 2. But all these make the same point. Which violated is the principle to flee from lust. 2 Timothy chapter 2. In verse 22. So flee youthful passions or lust. And the passage will point out about fleeing from these things as well. And so putting oneself in that situation is not fleeing from lust, nor is it fleeing from sexual immorality. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul pointed out to the church at Corinth, there were some problems there. One of the problems was there was a problem of them engaging in the sin of sexual immorality. And he told them in verse 18, flee sexual immorality. We already saw that dancing is one of those things that leads to sex. And so partaking in it is not fleeing sexual immorality. There's another one for you. The principle of revelries. We talked about this before. Part of the term for revelries has to do with this drinking in excess. But there's two parts to the word. The other part has to do with the fact of dancing. There's a couple of definitions. Sayer defines the word as feast and drinking parties that protract until late night and indulge in revelry. That's what we think of. Probably the first thing when we hear the word revelries is the feasting and drinking parties. But Lionel Scott, the Lionel Scott Greek lesson, it says it's carousal, merrymaking with music and dancing. Scott's Bible said revelries were such feasts as were accompanied with music and dancing, whatever could promote hilarity and sensual gratification. And so, here's these parties that were involved in merrymaking, music and dancing. It violates the principle of revelries as well. There's another one. It violates the principle of dress modestly. Go to 1 Timothy chapter 2. 1 Timothy chapter 2, beginning at verse 9. 1 Timothy 2, beginning at verse 9. Likewise also, that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women, and profess godliness with good works. See, the principle of dress modestly is a principle violated at these events. If one claims that modesty is a characteristic of the modern dance, you either have to be ignorant to what is going on or turn a blind eye to what's going on. If you look at what all is going on at these events, it's clear that modesty is not one of the things. I want you to consider a quote by Brother Wilson Adams. What he said concerning the prom and modesty. It's another one of the quotes, so bear with me. He said, prom is long in the night when curfews are lifted, inhibitions are abandoned, and romance is in the air along with hormones. Surrounded by young people of the world, it creates the perfect storm for a Christian to compromise in the area of purity. And it starts with the dress. My wife and I looked at online pictures of local proms from last year. The dress, or lack thereof, was embarrassing. After seeing a dozen or so shots of local teen girls, I saw way more than I needed to see. I had seen enough. The typical formal wear for prom is about one thing: cleavage and more cleavage. Apparently in our time, breasts are in, more literally out, according to the pictures. Blunt but true. Is there such a thing as modest formal wear? Sure. And there were a few. The majority, however, were very revealing. Do you really want your son to be exposed to girls who delight in exposing themselves? By the way, government schools are powerless to stop it. They claim to have dress restrictions, but there weren't any restrictions from the pictures I saw. By the way, if you argue that I shouldn't be looking at prom pictures, then guess what my question would be to you. Modesty and purity go hand in hand. As one young lady explained it, the girls today want to go to prom and look classy. Instead, they look trashy. After seeing the pictures, I agree. It hurts when I see young ladies claiming Christ who do not value themselves enough to dress modestly. I equally struggle with moms who can't see past the Cinderella moment. in the minds of teen boys? Sure, maybe your daughter dresses modestly, but are you willing to place her date in the company of the majority of girls who don't? Aren't we our brother's keeper? Men and women are wired differently. You know that. The men are visually stimulated. You know that too, I should say. Do we not as Christian men have a responsibility to help our daughters grow to understand human maleness and their responsibility in the male-female relationship? Sexual attraction isn't bad, it's good. God made it good. But He also regulated it and gave it boundaries. It is imperative, then, that we exercise caution not to place our children in situations where the boundaries are compromised. I think he's right. As he points out there, they went back, and him and his wife, and they looked at the pictures from the prom the year before and how these people were dressed. And the fact is, the way they were dressed was far from the biblical definition of what the Bible describes as modest dress. And that's what it is that people, how it is that people dress. Or how he points out that even if one dresses modestly, they put their day in the situation of being where there are those who are not dressed modestly. As he pointed out, remember, was on the foremost of the minds of teen boys. I want you to consider for something for a second. If I was to hit the button on this remote in my hand, and the next picture that popped, and the next thing that popped up was pictures from last year's prom of how people were dressed, what would you think? Would you find it inappropriate? I think we would all agree that it is. If it's inappropriate for us to view those pictures, why is it appropriate for us to let our kids see it in person? Why do young people choose to go? If it's inappropriate to see in pictures, it's inappropriate to go and see when we know it's there. I understand there are times you go out to the store, you'll see people dressed in modest stuff. But that's something that cannot necessarily be avoided. But this is a situation that can. And so the question is, why do we put ourselves in that situation, or let our children put themselves in a situation to see those things? Real quickly, let's talk about some arguments that are used to quote, justify dancing and the prom, and we'll answer those arguments. Number one, even if it excites others sexually, I should say, it does not affect me that way. I can control my thinking. So now if you tell somebody, you go to the prom, here's the pitfalls of dancing, and you'll get the reply, but I don't think that way. Well, first of all, I doubt that is usually the case, because we can easily overestimate our own strength. In Matthew chapter 26, Jesus said that they would all remain stumble that night because of him. Peter replies, not me, I'll go to the cross, I'll die with you. They might, but not me, Lord. In Matthew 26, 69 through 75, Peter denied our Lord not once, not twice, but 3 times. He overestimated his strength. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning in verse 12, it says, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Those that often think they are the strongest are the ones that find themselves weak and on their knees because they overestimated their strength. But I'm going to suppose for just a moment that's true. That there is no way that will cross your mind. What about the one you're with? What about the one you're with? These dances, it takes two. And even if you can control your thinking, what about the one you're dancing with? That's typically we don't get this reply. I can't control what others think. That's true. But we are responsible for how we influence others. In Luke chapter 17, beginning in verse 1, Jesus said the temptations to sin were sure to come, but woe to the one through whom they came. That whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble, it would be better for him if a millstone were tied around his neck and he were cast into the depths of the sea. If you ask me how I'd like to go out of this world, I don't have an answer for that. And I can tell you some ways I don't want to go out. And one of those is having concrete or a millstone tied around my neck and casting me into the deepest part of the ocean. Jesus said if one causes one of these little ones to stumble, That it would be better if that was the case. You see, by putting someone else in that position, you are responsible for the impact you have on them. Whether that's by how they dress or the actions that one undertakes. We are responsible for how we influence others. Well, then you may hear something like this, or perhaps the first thing you can hear is something like this. But men and women danced in the Bible. There are 4 categories of dancing in the Bible. The first of those is it refers to as religious dances in the Old Testament. Exodus 15, 20, 21, 2 Samuel 6, and in verse 14. I don't know exactly what that entails. We'll come to some things later to show that it would be like a modern dance. But whatever these religious dances were are not the same thing as the close, slow dance to the sensuous music that is talked about and takes place in dances today. Well, 1 Samuel 18 is dancing. Yes, it is an expression of rejoicing in 1 Samuel 18 and verse 6. As it talks about them rejoicing, it uses the term dancing. What about Luke 7:32, Job 21:11? Yes, it says dancing. It's talking about the play of children. Not the same kind of dance that takes place at these dances. And then there is the dance of Salome, Matthew 14 and verse 6. It's not quite like the modern dances today for close contact. But I tell you what, if you read Matthew 14 and verse 6, you can't help but come to the conclusion it must have been some kind of provocative dance by the reaction that was had. So whatever it was clearly wrong. But even that was still not the same as what we read in other places. Let's understand this. The modern dance, the dance we're talking about, is very modern. It's not like the dance referred to in the Old Testament or in the Bible. A Zondervan, Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible, said on the word dancing. While the mode of dancing is not known in detail, it is clear that women and men and women did not generally dance together. And there is no real evidence they ever did. Social amusement was hardly a major purpose of dancing, and the modern method of dancing by couples is unknown. Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible says, don't know what it entails, but I can tell you this, it wasn't the modern dance we're talking about today. Encyclopedia Britannica, the art, that should say, of dancing, says there is no evidence of couples dancing together. However, this was to happen much later, probably in the province in the 12th century. You're talking 1,100 years later from the New Testament. Well, I guess about 1,000, depending on when you think the Bible was completed. And when in the 12th century. But you're talking 10 to 1,100 years. From the time it's talked about in the Scriptures to the time the modern dance made its appearance, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, then that brings us to the final argument that was often heard. But I am not going to dance. Pastor replied again, I'm going, but don't worry, I'm not going to dance. Well, first and foremost, you're putting yourself in a situation to be tempted to dance. You may go into there and say, I'm not dancing. Remember, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. We're putting yourself in a situation to be tempted to dance. And as we've already saw, dancing is not fleeing fornication. 1 Corinthians 6 and 18 would tell us to do. Even if you don't dance, you're in a place where you're seeing things you ought not see in how others are dressed. You're in a place where you're having your date have to see things they ought not have to see by being in that situation. And then, consider this, we can leave the wrong impression. We can leave the wrong impression by going. I want you to think about this analogy with me for a minute. What would you think if you saw a Christian sitting in a bar? Suppose you were to go down to a restaurant. You go to the Mexican restaurant in New Martinsville, right to your left as you come in, you've been there, there's a bar. How would you suppose if you went to lunch today and you walked in the restaurant there and you looked to your left and you saw a member of the church sitting at the bar drinking? He's got a cup in his hand and he's drinking something. He's not drinking alcohol. If you ask him, he's going to tell you I'm not drinking alcohol. But there's people around him, and all the people around him, they do have alcohol. Maybe you see them with a Bud Light and Miller Lite. You don't know what he's got. You know he's got a cup of something. All the people around here are drinking. You see him sitting in a stool at a bar at a place where people are drinking. And he doesn't tell everybody I'm not drinking. He didn't stand up and go, hey, just so everybody knows that I'm drinking here is water, not whiskey. What would you conclude? What impression would you get from this? and you hurt your influence. I think we would agree to that. The same principle applies when going to the dance, whether one dances or not. We leave the impression. By the way, by going, whether one dances or not, whether we realize it or not, we give our endorsement. Because we're going to an event where things are taking place that ought not be taking place, as we saw from the definitions this morning. And by going there, we are giving our endorsement, whether we realize it or not. Dancing in the prom. We're talking about principles we all agree on. We define what dancing in the prom is. We notice how the appeal of dancing is sexual in nature. We talk about the biblical principles that are violated by dancing at the prom, and we answer the arguments used to justify dancing and going to the prom. That's dancing and the prom. As we come to a close this morning, we haven't been discussing this morning what one needs to do to be saved. But as we open up the Scriptures, we can see that for those that are an alien sinner, you need to hear the Word of God, Romans 10:17. To believe, John 3 and verse 16. To repent of your sins, Acts 17:30 and 31. To confess your faith, Romans 10:9 and 10. And be buried in the waters of baptism, Mark 16:16. Rising up to walk in the newness of life, Romans 6:1 through 4. And even though that's not what we discussed this morning, we still have an opportunity now for one that needs to respond in obedience to the gospel. Perhaps you're here, you look at your life and you say, I've not always lived as I should have lived. If it's a sin of a private nature, maybe God privately in prayer. If it's a sin of a public nature, you desire the prayers of the congregation. We'll gladly pray with you and for you, for God to forgive you. No matter your need, if we can assist you in any way, would you not, of course, get a stand as we sing.